For over 3,000 years, one grain quietly fed generations. It needed no cultivation, and it offered complete protein. Then, state laws made the ancient Ojibwe harvest a crime. How could a plant that plants itself become illegal? Free food on public water threatened an entire system of control. Unraveling this conflict means asking who really gets to decide what feeds a people. Long before borders or laws, the Ojibwe people followed a vision. Their elders spoke of a journey west, a search for the place where food grows on water. That promise guided families across forests and rivers, generation after generation, until they found the wild rice lakes of the Great Lakes. Here, manoomin, the good seed, rose each summer from shallow water, a gift from the Creator that needed no planting, only care. For more than 3,000 years, the people kept their part of the bargain. Each autumn, as the rice-making moon arrived, families gathered in canoes, offering tobacco and quiet prayers before the first stalk was touched. Harvest was not just work, but ceremony. The first grains were returned to the water, a sign of respect and a promise that the plant would return. Every family had their own stretch of lake, passed down like a story. Children learned from their grandparents which beds to leave untouched, which needed rest, and how to bend the stalks gently so most of the seed would fall back for next year. These rules lived in memory, not on paper. To break them was to break trust with the plant and with the ancestors. For the Ojibwe, manoomin was more than food. It was proof that the prophecy had been fulfilled and that the people still belonged to this place. At the lakeshore, people often said, "As long as the rice grows, we remain." Across the lakes, each family knew their own stretch of water. These territories were not marked by fences or signs, but by memory and respect. Boundaries were passed down from parent to child, honored as carefully as any law. When the rice-making moon signaled harvest, families returned year after year to the same beds. The rules were lived, not written. Never take too much, never harvest before the rice is ready, and always leave enough for the ducks, the fish, and the next season. Elders watched the water and judged the right moment to begin. If a bed looked thin, it was left alone. If another family's territory needed rest, neighbors would help guard it from overuse. The work itself followed a strict protocol. 2 people in a canoe, one poling and one using a pair of light cedar knockers to tap the ripe grains into the boat. The tools were simple but precise. Knockers carved to a set length and weight so they would not damage the stalks. Most of the grain fell back into the water, naturally replanting the bed for the next year. This was not just about food. It was about keeping the cycle going, so the lake would feed the people and the people would care for the lake. Protocol and precision kept the harvest sustainable. Trade routes stretched for hundreds of miles, connecting families and villages who all relied on manoomin. Rice was carried by canoe to other tribes, exchanged for maple sugar, fish, or furs. But the heart of the system was always the family, the territory, and the shared understanding that the gift of the rice depended on how it was treated. No outside law was needed. The rules were older than any state, and they worked. Gift summed the relationship between people and lake. In the late 1800s, the rules of the lakes changed without warning. Minnesota and Wisconsin began folding wild rice into their new game and fish codes, claiming authority over waters. Ojibwe families had managed for centuries. Suddenly, harvest required state paperwork. Licenses, fixed seasons, and equipment rules arrived, and none of them were written with tribal knowledge in mind. The law now said when the rice was ready, how it could be gathered, and who had the right to do it. Wardens patrolled the beds and landings, checking papers, counting hours, measuring canoes and sticks. If a family went out on their traditional lake without a state permit or before the official opening, they could be stopped on the water and their rice and tools confiscated. Canoes and knockers, handed down for generations, were seized as evidence. Fines followed, or a trip to the county jail. For many, the risk became too great. Some elders recall wardens waiting at the landings, watching as families tried to keep their harvest secret. Others remember the fear that came with each patrol boat. The state could take not just the food, but the means to gather it, and sometimes even the children, if parents were charged with neglect for missing school or refusing wage work in favor of the rice season. The message was clear. What had always been a sacred duty between people and plant was now a potential crime. The law recast tradition as trespass, and Ojibwe families found themselves fighting for the right to feed themselves in the same waters their ancestors had protected. Dams changed the fate of wild rice almost overnight. In northern Wisconsin, the Chippewa Flowage Dam, finished in the early 1920s, flooded more than 15,000 acres of land, lakes, marshes, gardens, and wild rice beds that had fed Ojibwe families for generations. Shallow lakes, once thick with manoomin, disappeared under deep water. Places where rice had always returned each year were drowned, leaving only open reservoir and stumps where canoes once glided at harvest. The loss was not just ecological, it was economic. With the rice beds gone, families lost a food source, a trade good, and a reason to return to ancestral camps. While the state justified these projects as progress, citing hydroelectric power and flood control, what followed was a vacuum. Into that space stepped a new kind of harvest, far from the lakes of Minnesota and Wisconsin. By the 1950s, California farmers had begun growing wild rice in irrigated paddies, using machines to plant and harvest what had once been a wild, self-seeding grain. The process was faster, cheaper, and indifferent to tradition. Within a generation, grocery store shelves were filled with wild rice that had never seen a northern lake. By the 1980s, cultivated paddy rice made up the overwhelming majority of the market, leaving hand-harvested lake rice as a rare, premium product. The shift was nearly total. Researchers estimate that 9 out of 10 pounds of wild rice sold in stores now comes from paddies, not natural lakes. The combination of flooded habitat and market displacement did what regulation alone could not, removing wild rice from the center of Ojibwe life and replacing it with a product that owed nothing to the old rules, the old waters, or the people who once depended on them. Crowds gathered at the boat landings, shouting slogans in the dark. Save a walleye, spear an Indian. Rocks and beer bottles flew past families trying to launch their canoes. Ojibwe harvesters stood shoulder to shoulder, some with children, some with elders, waiting for the wardens to arrive. The Tribble brothers, Fred and Mike, became known for refusing to back down. They loaded their gear, made their way to the water, and let the arrests come. The citation, each confiscated canoe, was a deliberate test. The plan was simple: break the law, get charged, and force the courts to face the treaties. Night after night, the tension grew. Some harvesters lost jobs, others faced threats at home, but none turned away. The price was real. Marriages strained, families split, but the right to harvest was worth risking everything. The fury at the landings became the evidence in the courtroom. In 1983, a federal appeals court handed down the Voigt decision, confirming that the Ojibwe's right to harvest, hunt, and fish in the ceded territory of Wisconsin had never been extinguished. The ruling did not come as a favor. It was the result of years of deliberate arrests, court battles, and families standing firm through backlash. The court made clear, treaty rights are federal law, not privileges to be managed or revoked by the state. 16 years later, the Supreme Court decided Minnesota versus Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa Indians. In a narrow 5-4 ruling, the justices affirmed that the 1837 treaty still protected OF reservation harvest in Minnesota. These victories gave rise to the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, a tribal agency with real power to manage resources alongside the states. For the first time in generations, Ojibwe law and science were written back into the rules of the lakes. Today, true wild rice survives on contested waters, still feeding resistance, still refusing ownership. As climate change threatens food security, self-renewing native crops offer a path forward. The fight for manoomin isn't just about a grain, it is about who decides what can be freely gathered and by whom.